Now, as we know, we've reached the final section in our series on Mark, and we've been going this through, I think Mike mentioned, 15 months, yeah. And it probably seems like longer to most people, but here we are, we're at the end of it now. And so we're going to see what we can find, what we can learn from this passage. What has it got to say to us? Now, one way to approach the passage is what they say synoptically. That is to treat it alongside, in parallel with the material we get from the other Gospels, Matthew, Luke. Not really John, because it's not a synoptic Gospel, but sometimes we could get material from John. And the modern commentaries, if they discuss this passage at all, simply treat it as derivative from these Gospels. That is, that it's simply a compilation of material already present in Matthew, Luke and John. And I would say as a side note that if this was so, if this had been compiled to give a satisfactory conclusion to a book whose original ending was missing, then they did a pretty poor job, because you'd expect this to agree exactly with all the material in Matthew, Luke and John. And in general it does so, but there are some slight differences, some slight additions. Some of the things it says are different. But tonight, we're going to follow the approach that we've been carrying on throughout the study of Mark. We've focused on Mark's message. Mark hasn't just randomly compiled a chronological account. He has carefully selected and purposely put together various parts of material to actually demonstrate certain things about Jesus Christ. And something I hadn't realised is Mark, throughout this book, frequently uses a structural device known as a three-step progression. Apparently, Mark's interest in series of threes is well known. Well, I didn't know that. Though I must admit, it's news to me. He uses it to organise not just nouns and phrases, but whole episodes, and even whole series of episodes. It's sometimes called a threefold pattern with progressive heightening. That means that you have two sections, and then they build up to a third section, and it provides a kind of climax. So, for example, in Mark 1, verses 4 to 8, could be summarised in these three sections: baptism of John, description of John, witness of John to Jesus, that kind of thing. And he does that quite frequently. And sometimes he does something else. He has four sections. He has those three sections, then he has a kind of conclusion, a kind of an X at the end. And he does this actually as much as he does the threefold one. Now, it so happens that our section concludes with this four sections. So we have the appearance of Mary, 9 to 11, the appearance to the two disciples, 12 to 13, the appearance to the 11, 14 to 18, and its conclusion, 19 to 20. It's a sort of similar pattern, a similar template that he uses throughout the book. Now, the main theme of this section is faith and unbelief of the gospel. And it's actually been a recurrent theme throughout Mark. And this section concludes the gospel. We started off in chapter 1, where Mark announces that he's going to tell us about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And here he finishes with the gospel of Jesus Christ and its proclamation to the world. We see the witness of those who rejected it by other disciples, who are rebuked for failing to believe the witness of others, the very message that they will be proclaiming to others, and then from there boldly preaching in faith that message. So first of all, the appearance of Mary. It starts off like this. When Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had driven 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him and who were mourning and weeping. When they heard that Jesus was alive and that she had seen him, they did not believe it. So we come to a new section, a new thought. So far, in the verses 1 to 8, we've heard about the empty tomb, the actual suggestion, the announcement by the angel declaring that Christ is risen. But that is all. The women flee from the empty tomb, not saying to anybody, terrified. And if we ended at this point, we wouldn't have what Mark had originally promised. We wouldn't have the gospel. Because throughout the New Testament, the fact that Christ died, rose and ascended is central to the very definition of what the gospel is. More than that, The existence of witnesses to the risen Christ was foundational to the existence of the New Testament church. And Mark, if it did not have that, would serve very little useful purpose. But what we read here should be surprising. So who is the first witness? Who is given the honour in the church of God to be the first person to see Jesus after his resurrection and bear witness to it? To whom did Jesus choose to reveal himself before anybody else? Someone of standing? Someone of reputation? Someone whose testimony would carry weight in the church and outside? It is Mary Magdalene. And what is incredible is that the gospel is utterly unapologetic in declaring this in a day which Rod said a few weeks ago that the testimony of a woman was seen in that culture as worthless. In one of the daily prayers of the time, a man thanked God that he was not born a Gentile, slave, or a woman. But there's something more. This was not simply any woman. This was a woman who everyone knew and did not forget her past. It's a past no one could forget, but Jesus had healed her from it, having cast 7 demons out. Luke mentions this fact, but he doesn't say that they were cast out. He just says they went out. And here we have the explicit agency of Jesus in healing her. Now, Mark mentions Mary more than the other synoptic gospels, Matthew and Luke. And in religious art, Mary is often depicted as the woman who anointed Jesus with the precious ointment in Luke. But we've actually got no evidence for this. But we do know she was someone who loved Jesus arguably above all others. Despite all that had happened, she had remained faithful. Even when the most faithful of disciples had deserted, she was there keeping vigil. When all hopes appeared to have gone, she was ready to lead others to anoint the body of Jesus. Now, some would argue that her faith was clearly weak and deficient because she didn't really grasp the promise that Jesus had said that he'd rise from the dead. But we don't know what she knew. She may not have been privy to what the Lord told the disciples. She may have known this, but even if we concede that, and she had not understood those prophecies of the resurrection, she never wavered in following Jesus, and her love for him never faltered. So it illustrates true devotion, true love for Christ, and it exhibits himself when people cling to Jesus, following, trusting him, serving him when all else is dark. And I dare say she did not feel the things that we would normally associate with great faith or love. And actually her state of mind would have been really fear, numbness, grief and sadness. But she nevertheless kept going. She would remain devoted to him. And she was chosen, selected by Jesus to be the first witness of the resurrection. And yet we see quite a different spirit in the disciples. The women went and told the disciples, and they did not believe them. Their not believing was not doubting. The original word is one of disbelief, one of actively refusing to believe. They mourned and wept, they wallowed in their grief, but they refused the messengers that Jesus sent them, declaring his return. So imagine how frustrating it must have been to the women to tell them the good news and just told to shut up. So it does tell us something about the disciples at that point, which makes us realise that without the real evidence of this, the church could not have happened. The disciples were unbelieving and miserable, and they were content to remain so. They were not naive, credulous, gullible men wishing to believe, looking for any slight sign for consolation. Their faith had crashed totally. They were cynical, they were incredulous. And perhaps at this point they were so hurt that they would prefer not to have hope in the case it was going to be dashed again. And sometimes unbelievers would like to point out, well, of course, these are gullible people, but it's not like that. These people went from unbelief to belief, and something must have changed their minds, and that could only have been the visible appearance of Jesus. So the next section we have the appearance of the 2 disciples. Afterward, Jesus appeared in a different form to 2 of them while they were walking in the country. These returned and reported it to the rest, but they did not believe them either. Now, some have complained this is a rather brief summary of what we have in Luke, but it's actually entirely in keeping with Mark's purpose. Here, the 2 men, They're not of the 11, but they are of that number which you previously read, mourned and wept and did not believe the women. But they see Jesus for themselves. We read here that they appear in a different form, which would probably explain why they did not recognize him and why in the Gospel of Luke Jesus was not immediately recognized. But even on their return to the disciples, they were not believed. And again, the original word for that, not believed, is quite emphatic. So the next one is the 11. Later, Jesus appeared to the 11 as they were eating. He rebuked them for their lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he had risen. When it says in our text later, it would, first sense, we'd think it was a time sense. But it also could mean in the sense lastly or last of all, suggesting that what's described is not simply a chronological account, although it is in sequence, but it's a climax of a progression of witnesses sent. The word appeared here gives the appearance of the idea of suddenness and unexpectedness. And again, the disciples are reproached by Jesus. They're rebuked for their unbelief, for their incredulity. And this is simply that they didn't believe. It's they did not believe the testimony of others who were sent to them. And then it says, he said to them, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, and whoever does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. In my name they will drive out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes with their hands, and when they drink deadly poison, it will not hurt them at all. They will place their hands on sick people, and they will get well. So we see here that despite their unbelief, despite their failure, and the rebuke that Jesus gives them, he then entrusts them with not just a commission, he entrusts them with the commission, the Great Commission, a task which is beyond human agency or power. Now, where it was given, the circumstances, we're not actually told. That's recorded elsewhere, because it's not Mark's purpose to give details, but to list the links in what happened next. And their commission is this: in their going out into the world, wherever they went, to proclaim the good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ to the whole of creation. And this is not actually what is said in Matthew or Luke. It is here we receive the Great Commission to preach the gospel to every creature. In Matthew, it is to make disciples of all nations, to call out individuals into the kingdom of God. But in this chapter, we have Christ's commission to declare, to preach the good news of the gospel to all. And so to these weak, doubting, unbelieving men, the Lord gives them this privilege, this incredible responsibility to declare the good news to the whole world. It then carries on, the one who believes and is baptized, that is, confesses their faith and joins with those who believe, will be saved. Now, it mentions baptism here, whether we like it or not. And whether we like it or not, baptism was central to the New Testament church. It wasn't a sacramental thing that somehow it had any particular power of its own. It was simply obedience to Jesus' command. And we see that continued in the book of Acts. And I'm not saying that just because we're Baptists, but because it was part of the gospel proclamation. Now, it is to believe, but it is also suggesting that a public declaration of faith, and the ceremony was to declare to others that that was so. It's quite common nowadays for people to have very personal religions, which a personal faith, which actually doesn't involve anybody else at all. It's a complete person in isolation, me and my Bible, me and my faith, and nobody else is connected to it at all. But that is not what the New Testament concept of faith was. Once one became a Christian, one joined with others with like faith. One joined a community of others who shared that faith. And of course, we're not saying that baptism is essential to salvation. It's not saying that here at all, because it says, those who do not believe, he that believes not, are condemned for not believing, not because they're not baptized. Now, the final section declares that signs will follow. And I haven't got time to go through this, but if we go through the book of Acts, which hopefully we're going to be going in a few months' time, we'll see these here, that we cite various signs, but one of them, they're all mentioned in the book of Acts. And this is actually one of the least popular sections of this passage, because this is the bit people don't actually like. And the suspicion is that this is why in perhaps the 2nd century or 3rd century, in certain parts of the Mediterranean, it was actually removed because it was open to such abuse. And generally in the Alexandrian school, that's the assumption, is that's what happened there. Now, we come to our conclusion. After the Lord had spoken to them, he was taken up into heaven, and he sat at the right hand of God. Then the disciples went out and preached everywhere, and the Lord worked with them, confirming his word by the signs that accompanied it. And so this section begins. So then, the author is giving his conclusion. He's finishing his narrative. Here he is, the Lord Jesus. It is not just Jesus anymore, which we were introduced at the beginning of the gospel. This is the Lord, Kyrios. And the word Kyrios is actually used for God in the Greek translations of the Old Testament. And the Lord is now sitting at God's right hand. He is in the place of honour, of privilege, of shared power. And he's there now. He is for us. He's taking our side. He's mediating for us and interceding for us. That is a message for us. And the disciples, the seeming impossible happens. These faithless and discouraged men have now done what is humanly impossible. With God's help, they've accomplished the Great Commission. They have gone out, and we read that they fulfilled it. They obeyed and preached, announcing and proclaiming the new faith in all parts of the world. And the Lord honoured them. He fulfilled his promise to them, working with them. So in conclusion, we've come to the end of Mark, but 4 takeaway messages. The first is Mary's faith. We don't read that Mary had any great gifts, opportunities or privileges. She was, after all, a woman in a day when women were thought of nothing of. Yet despite all appearances, against all discouragements, she loved and believed in Jesus. And this was not just a sentimental faith, a love based on feeling, but a determined, persistent allegiance and commitment to Jesus. And this is something, whoever we are, is open to us. The Lord's criticism of the disciples was not simply that they did not believe, but they did not believe the testimony of others. And ironically, they would be declaring their gospel, expecting others to believe who had not seen him either. So how do we know that Jesus lives? Because we have read and believed the testimony of others. We have it here in our Bibles that Jesus lived, died and rose again. And we know these things are true because they are true in our own experience. We know that whatever Jesus said about us, we know it's true. Now, we might wish that we had seen Jesus. We might wish that somehow it would have been easier for us to do this. But in John 20, Jesus speaks to his disciples. He says, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed." And that is a blessing that we can receive too. The third one is the Lord is with us. It is the duty of his people to spread the good news of the gospel. And we might think that task is impossible, beyond our power and hopeless. And yet the Lord transformed and empowered a group of faithless men with no resources, and he can do the same for us. And finally, Jesus our Lord is alive today. He is in the place of power and authority at the right hand of God, and he is there for us, representing for us, mediating for us. So I end by quoting Hebrews 4:14. "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we have not a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weakness, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in our time of need."